everyone. My name is Felienne Hermans. I'm assistant professor at Delft University of Technology. This is my Twitter handle, so if you're on Twitter, is the Wi-Fi on? So if you have cell service and you're on Twitter, then you can mention me if you talk about this talk. Some people might know me from my work on spreadsheets. I believe this was mentioned in the morning as well. Quick summary of my research. I built an IDE for Excel. So think JUnit and Resharper for Excel. But that's not what this talk is about at all. So if you're here, if my spreadsheet frame has attracted you to this room, my audio is a spreadsheet. I'm sorry, this talk is not at all about Excel. This talk is about a board game called Quarto. And Quarto is a board game. It's a little bit like 4 in a row, but it has more dimensions. So normal 4 in a row, the pieces only have 2 dimensions. They are black and white, or sometimes they are yellow and red, and you have to get 4 in a row of one of the dimensions. Quarto is like that, but the pieces in Quarto have 4 properties. So you have 4 dimensions. As you can see in this picture, the pieces can be white or black, they can be short or long, they can be square or round shaped, and they can have a dent in the top or not. So one day I was playing this board game with my boyfriend at home. My rich social life led me to my dinner table with my partner, and we were wondering, after a few games, could this board game actually end in a tie? Is it possible? Because in the few games that we had played, one of us had won all the time. So how I imagine this will go down in a different universe with normal non-geek people, they would be like, yeah, I don't know, I don't care, the end. Very short talk. However, in Geekland, of course, we were like, let's figure this out. Let's throw the board game aside, take out our laptops, and actually figure out if this can end in a tie. So a strategy you could use is, of course, brute force. This board game is not very big. It's just 4 by 4. So you could think, let's just calculate all possible board assignments and see if it is actually possible. So what are the number of possibilities? On the first field, you could place 16 different pieces. And then you've placed 1, so the next one you would have 14 and 13, etc. This is quite a lot. If you calculate it, it is 16, faculty of 16, which is this number. So this number of field assignments, that's really a lot. And then for every assignment, you have to do 160 checks, because for every row, you have to do 16 checks, 4 times 4 properties, and there are 10 ways in which you can have a row, either the rows, or the columns, or the 2 diagonals. So that's a lot of checks. So suppose you have this machine here, a MacBook, it has 4 cores that are 2.6 gigahertz, so theoretically, disregarding overhead, you could do 1 billion checks a second, but still, this would take about 320,000 seconds, which is about 90 hours. That is too long for a board game night. That's more like a board game week. So it is a solution. You could say, okay, the problem is solved, but it's not really solved. We should be able to do a bit better than that. So then I vaguely remembered this thing I went to once called university. And I had a course on these things. I had a course called Automated Reasoning that taught us how you can address these type of problems. So I thought, okay, maybe there's a way we can do better than brute force. Let's, to quote Mark Watney, science the shit out of this. So what is the idea of using automated reasoning or satisfiability solvers for this problem? The idea of using a tool, satisfiability in this case, is normally you have a problem and you want to solve that problem. Preferably you would do it directly. However, sometimes that's not possible and you're going to use an alternative representation. So you take your problem, you represent it in a different way, then in that alternative reality, you solve your problem, and then you transform your solution in the alternative space back to reality. This might sound very abstract. I see some puzzled faces. So let's look at this in a very simple example. Suppose I want to divide a big integer, 78,974, lots of numbers. I want to divide this by 2. So what I would do if I'm in the decimal world is I could do this step by step. So I divide this by 2, and then 70, and then 900, etc. And then I arrive at my solution. This is a possibility, but it takes a lot of steps to divide by 2 if you're in the decimal representation. So suppose I would have this big number in a binary representation. So instead of a decimal representation, I'm representing the number as binary. So now if I want to divide to 2, who knows how I can super quickly divide by 2 here? Bit shift, yes. You just cross out one of the zeros. So it's one step of effort, and we have divided by 2. So once we have transformed our problem into a different representation, suddenly some solutions are very easy, like dividing by 2. And then, of course, we have to go back to the original representation, because this is not a valid solution if you want to divide 78,000 by 2. So we represent it back, and then we have a solution in the decimal space, but secretly we took a path through binary. So this is exactly the same thing we're going to do with the Quarto problem. We will take our problem, we will transform the problem into satisfiability, there we will solve it, and then we will go back to the original world. So what is satisfiability? Before I can talk about what exactly satisfiability is, I will have to do a quick intro into Boolean logic, because that is what satisfiability is based on. A famous joke amongst mathematicians and computer science is this: would you like coffee or tea? And then people say yes. So we can represent this in Boolean logic as follows: coffee or tea. This symbol, you'll see it a lot in my presentation, is called the OR symbol, so it's coffee or tea. You can also say, do you want coffee and tea? That would look like this: coffee and tea. In this comic, this guy doesn't want coffee and tea. He says no. So then we add a negation before it. That's a negation sign. So he doesn't want coffee and tea. So do you want coffee? No, he doesn't want coffee. So based on the propositions we have now, coffee or tea is what he wants, yes. Not coffee and tea, not coffee. So do you want tea? Yes, he wants tea. So from these propositions, we can conclude there's nothing else that he can want based on these rules but tea. These comics, by the way, are from this fantastic book. You should, if you haven't read it, you should definitely do it. It's very, very cool. It's like a fantasy adventure of Lovelace and Babbage. You can see how beautiful the pictures are. It's really, really fun, fake but cool history of computer science. So we will use these Boolean propositions for satisfiability. The idea of satisfiability is you have such a Boolean proposition, let's say P or non-Q. Satisfiability is going to look for values for P and Q in such a way that this entire proposition will result in true. So we want to find a truth assignment such that the whole thing is true. So in this case, for example, we could say P is true and Q is false. Then non-Q is also true. So we have true or true, which is super true. Lots of true. So the good news of representing your problem as a Boolean proposition is there are lots of very, very good tools called SAT solvers. If you want the world, I guess, to advance in a certain topic, what you should do is hold competitions. So there are yearly competitions where many researchers and companies submit SAT solvers to be as quick as possible in solving those satisfiability propositions. So how does this tool work? You give them a proposition, and they say, yes, it is possible to satisfy this, or no, it's not possible. And typically, they will also tell you what a truth assignment is to make sure that the proposition is indeed satisfiable. So that was the good news. The bad news is it's not going to make our problem any simpler. If you know what it means, the problem is still NP hard. If you don't know what that means, it's very, 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 very hard. So using an SAT solver is not going to make our problem simpler. This is exactly the same as taking a decimal representation and transforming it into binary. It looks like you've made the problem a lot simpler, but it's as complex because you have to translate it into a longer representation. So we're not cheating here, we're not making the problem simpler, but because so much research has been devoted to make these SAT solvers so powerful, it will still help us to use this alternate representation. So the idea of solving our Quarto problem is we're going to use Boolean propositions to express the whole situation of the game, and then we're going to ask an SAT solver, is it possible to find an assignment for this? So what we're going to do, every field on our square board, we're going to represent it by 4 Booleans. And each of the 4 Booleans represent one of the 4 properties. So it doesn't really matter, of course, which one you map to which. So you could say this field here, 0, 0, 3. No, that should actually be that one. Doesn't matter. You have 4 Booleans where one represents black and white, one represents long and short, one represents square and round, and one represents flat or a dent. So if we have all these variables, we can express what a tie means. Because we can say there's no row, or a column, or a diagonal, where one of these 4 properties is the same. Because if one of the 4 properties is the same anywhere, someone would win. So that cannot be the case. For all properties P, for all combinations S, so those are rows, columns, and diagonals, the stones within that combination, so the 4 in them, cannot have one P that is the same. So that an example would be like this. So you have property 0, that was the color, I believe. So you express all the fields. It cannot be the case that all the fields are the same. So we're almost there. There's just one more thing. It shouldn't be the case that there are 2 the same pieces. It would be cheating if I would go to the toy shop and buy 5 Quarto sets and then make a tie with all these pieces. They have to come from one set, which means that all of them are different. So we have to express that as well. So we have to say field for all of the fields, for instance 0, 0 and 0, 1, they can be exactly the same, which means it cannot be the case that all of the 4 properties are the same. So by defining those 2 rules for all of the variables, we have expressed what a tie means. You cannot have 4 in a row, and you have to have 16 different pieces. Of course, that's a lot of rows, and I'm not going to type all of them. I don't always use an SAT solver, but when I do, I generate the input file. It's lots of work to type that, and of course very error prone. So I wrote a little C# program that just loops over all the fields in the board and outputs the Boolean propositions that go with it. So the row columns, the diagonal columns, the columns, and one rule that says not all the pieces should be the same. So you could say, well, we have transformed the problem into SAT now, but why is it better? You just said, well, there are these tools called SAT solvers and they will work very quickly. But how does it actually work? So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the internal workings of SAT solvers to explain to you why it is that we are now actually in a better place than we were when we were brute forcing. So how does an SAT solver work? The basic idea is just to try all options. So it's still a little bit like brute force. So suppose we have this proposition P or Q and non-R. We make a truth table. So we try all of the values for the 3 variables. 0, 0, 0. No, that's not resulting in true. And we repeat that until we have something that is true. Of course, this is not very quick. This is just exploring the entire state space, all of the variables. That is not going to help us. We cannot just try all options, or we would be in the same situation as we were while we were brute forcing, and that's going to take us 90 hours. So let me tell you about this one little trick that SAT solvers hate because it reduces state space. What you can do is suppose you have a proposition of this form, P or non-Q and Q. If we have this, we can say that is equisatisfiable as just solving P. So we can make our expression a lot easier. Why is this the case? Well, this is an and. So if this and that have to be true, that means we can know for a fact that both parts have to be true. Because otherwise an and will fail. So we know that this Q needs to be true. Otherwise we're failing. That means that non-Q is false. And because both these sides of the and have to be true, and we've already lost the non-Q, that is never going to happen, it needs to be the case that P is true. That's the only option we have left in the first part of the equation to get the truth value. So from such a proposition, we can conclude that P needs to be true. This is called unit resolution, and this is one of the tricks that SAT solvers use to quickly reduce state space. And of course, I have just now explained it to you, as we professionals call this a proof by hand waving, but you can prove this for the general case. So even on my days off, I'm still a professor, so I have some homework. If you really want to do some interesting work, then you can try to prove that this in fact holds for the more general case. Last time I gave this talk, someone within the hour, I think, tweeted me a proof. So now you know what you're up against. When I gave this talk last time also, I think this was the spot where some people got a little bit confused. It's some hard math. So what do? If you're in trouble and you need help? Of course, you call in the help of rock legends. So let me explain unit proposition again to you by using Eddie Van Halen. I hope this will work. He is known, of course, apart from his music, for his crazy demand list on his writer. If he would give a concert with Van Halen, he would say, there cannot be any brown M&Ms in a bowl of M&Ms that has to be on the table, or we have the right to cancel the entire show. So you could say this is crazy. This is just extraordinary rock star behavior. He's spoiled and he wants to have his stuff. But actually, this is really very, very smart. What Van Halen is doing here is using unit resolution. Really. Because suppose we have a long proposition like this. So this has to hold, and this has to hold, and that has to hold, and that has to hold. The idea behind his blue M&Ms were that many things in that writer were actually very, very important. So it mattered that the stage could handle the right amount of weight, and that they had the right brand of drum kit. These things were all really important. And by checking the brown M&Ms, he just made sure that all of the others were taken care of as well. Because if the brown M&Ms failed, all the other things would have failed as well. So it's actually a very smart trick to add something that you can quickly check. And if that fails, everything is lost. That happens here as well. 1, 2, 3, and 4, all of them need to be true. If one of them fails, we can cancel the whole show. We can stop doing the whole SAT solving, because if one of these fails, there is no hope. So this is the intuition behind unit resolution. For all of these, it has to be true. And then within such a proposition, all of them are or clauses. So 1, 2, 3, 4, if you look at them, you see they only have ors. So that means only one of these has to be true, then it's fine, and that holds for all the clauses. So I hope that helps a little bit to explain to you how to do unit resolution. So let's have a look at how it actually works. So we are still doing the we try all options path. We have no other choice. We cannot do anything in this situation, so we just pick a variable, doesn't matter, let's say P, and we just say, okay, it's true. It doesn't really matter what we pick or which variable we pick. So let's say we pick P is true. That means non-P is false, and I indicate that here, as you can see, I guess, with green and red to indicate the truth values. So what happens now if you pay close attention to clause number 3? you can see here that we're almost in a brown M&M situation. Because if non-S is false, which means if S is true, both of these are false, then we've lost. Because in all of the rows, we have to have something that's true. So this S here, it cannot be true, because then row 3 is lost. So instead of randomly taking a variable and assigning it, we now have deduced a variable, and we have to set S to true. Unfortunately, if we look at all the clauses now, there's no way we can apply unit resolution somewhere else, because there's no situation in which all our hope lies in one variable only. So now we just pick one. So if we cannot deduce anything, we just pick one. So we say, okay, let's say Q is true, so non-Q is false. And then again, we can do unit resolution, because here we only have one player in the game, still R. So R has to be true, and now we have an assignment. So out of the 4 variables that we have in our proposition, we only need to decide on 2, because the other 2 were reduced. So we have reduced our state space we have pruned the state space largely by not having to go through all the 4 variables, but only have to pick 2. So that is one trick that SAT solvers use to be able to solve satisfiability very, very quickly. A second trick is called watches. And this is very, very clever. This is I wish I had come up with this. It's so clever. If you read the research paper in which this was proposed, it brings tears to your eyes. It's so clever. Let me show you how it works. So in this situation, that's very small, it's quite easy to see where we can apply unit resolution, because, well, there are only 4 variables, so it's very cheap to see, are all of them assigned, and is there a risk that all of them have turned red? But suppose you have a long list of clauses, and this is not uncommon if you're transforming normal problems, real-life problems, into satisfiability. You're often left with thousands and thousands of clauses. I don't remember the exact number, but I think the solution that we're going to look at later has something like 6,000 clauses, so that's lots of them. So it gets really expensive in every step of assigning a variable to go through all of these clauses to see, hey, can unit resolution be applied here? Pay attention to the fact that we can only apply unit resolution if all of the variables but one are assigned. We can only deduce the value of one variable. All the others are red. So this one is our final hope. This has to be green. So only in that situation where everything is assigned, then we can do unit resolution. So if more than 2 are unassigned, we're never going to resolve anything there. So the idea of watches is that they keep an eye on all the clauses where we could potentially apply unit resolution. So the watches here are purple. These are the variables we just randomly picked. We just picked the first ones. These are the variables that we're going to look at. Doesn't really matter which ones we pick. We just, per clause, we pick 2. We make them purple. So if a watch variable gets assigned, it has to move. If this is no longer the variable that we're looking at, it needs to go. So suppose here again we set non-S to true, so S to false. Then this watch has to move. We can no longer watch S because it has now been assigned. These turn false, and the watches go there. And here's the very, very smart thing, because now you might still think, why is this helping us? The really smart thing is because watches watch unassigned variables, they don't have to move if we backtrack. We haven't talked about backtracking before because my previous example, all my choices were perfect. However, that's of course not always the case. Sometimes you pick a variable and you end up in a state where not all of them are, one of them is false. All variables in one line are false, so we're stuck. And the smart thing is about watches is when that happens, the watches don't have to move. Let me show you how that looks like. So suppose somewhere down here we were forced to pick S is true because we had P, this P was false, so S here needed to be true. Unfortunately, that gives a conflict here on this line 3. So now we have to flip the value because we're in a conflict situation. We have to backtrack. Conflict. So we swap S, but we don't have to touch the watches because they were only watching unassigned variables. And that makes it very, very cheap. So it's really like a very smart database index. It looks at a few of the items, and you can immediately check their value. And you only have to move if they're assigned. So let's go back to our original problem. We have now looked a little bit into how SAT solvers work, and there are lots of other tricks that they use, but these are two that really help speed up. So we've solved our problem. We have expressed our problem in SAT, and we now have a good understanding of what the SAT solver will do with our problem. There's one problem though. If you look at the rules that we generate, not this one, and not all of these, it's not solved. Because the rules that we generate, look at these rules, they don't really look like these rules. The rules that we used for unit resolution have a very specific format. All lines are conjunctions or clauses, and all the rows are joined with conjunctions. This has equal signs, and it has braces, brackets. So that's not really good. The thing about SAT solvers is they're a little bit like Eddie Van Halen. They have their specific preferences. So these tools, they don't take all input formats. They can solve MP hard problems, but they cannot do a little bit of string manipulation for you. No, 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 no. String manipulation is your own problem. You have to give me the exact nice input format, and I will show you an example. It's really very picky. Eddie Van Halen would think it's a little bit of a princess. But we have to transform it into this format called DMAX. Otherwise, the SAT solver, it's not going to take it. So unfortunately, we're still not done. We have to still transform the rules that we have generated into CNF. So, some F# to the rescue. I wrote a little library in F# that helps you express all the things you want to express in a proposition. So you can have variable names, not or and true or false as Booleans. Those are sometimes needed for reductions. And I didn't have an equals in my language. I just introduced an equals function that immediately outputs what an equals means in terms of ands and ors, because otherwise there would be so many rewrite rules in my language. Here are a number of equivalencies that we need. So for instance, if I have A and true, that is the same as having A. If I have A and false, I will have false. So I can apply these reductions all the time in order to take my ugly input with equals and big nons into CNF. So what I also do is a rule called De Morgan. If I have double negation, I can remove it. And this, the distribution rule, it pushes all the ors into the proposition. So you end up with something where all the ors are in the belly of the whole proposition. And I apply all these normalization rules all the time. This is a fixed point operation until nothing changes anymore. If this was a little bit too quick for you, or if you have your own satisfiability problems, this code is all on GitHub. So you can play with it and see how you can produce your own favorite propositions. So how does this work? You can define variables just with string names. So you can define a nice term in somewhat human readable language. So it's or not A is B, not B is C. That is already reduced to this because the equals is rewritten. And then I use this to make it into DMAX. So all these rules are only to make the already normalized proposition into that crazy Dmax format. Here you can see it. This is how it looks like. So this is sort of normal readable. This is what the SAT solver wants. Look how nice it is. For instance, you have to explain it. Well, it always has to start with P and C and F. Then you have to tell it how many variables you have. Well, okay, that might be. But you also have to tell it how many clauses you have, aka the number of lines in the file. It gets worse. All lines have to end in a 0 and a line break. Because just line break, it is not enough to end the line. No, it needs a 0. Why? I don't know. But this is the format. So I wrote a little library to take this and output the exact perfect formats so that the SAT solver is happy. So you get something like this. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, variables can only be numbers. Because, I don't know, reasons. So this is what eventually comes out of the whole exercise and what can go into an SAT solver. So now the problem is really, really solved. At this point, it's somewhere close to midnight. So I'm really excited about what the answer will be. So look, let me take you back to that Wednesday night where I finally got the answer to whether or not this could end in a tie. There you go. Bam! Look how quick that was. Let me play it again. Let me just play it again. Because if you blinked, you would have missed it. There you go. Typing is longer than solving. Bam! See how quick that is. I mean, if we would have done it naively, it would have taken us 90 hours. And now it's like, just like 1 second. Like, yeah, science! How awesome is that? It's such a ridiculous speed up. So, I mean, that was a high point in my life. Again, I have a rich social life that keeps me occupied. But this was also very cool. So there's one thing, though. One more thing, I promise. Okay, a few more maybe. We have solved our situation now in SAT. So what I can also do, in addition to just asking him, is it satisfiable, I can also get an output file. And that output file will then contain the variable assignments. So it no longer just says yes or no, it says yes or no, and here is the variable assignment.
When you ask what to satisfy mean, does it now mean that there is no solution?
No, that means, this means that there is a possibility. That's what satisfiable means. So I explained to him how a draw looks like, and he says, yes, this is possible. So what we're getting now is not just a yes or no, but also yes in this specific way. So you get nice little, of course, in SAT solver's favorite input format is also its output format. So here are all the variables, and if they have a minus, then they're false, and if they don't have a minus, they're true. So yes, of course, I could have written a parser to parse it back. I have, in fact, it is on GitHub now, but at this stage, I was not very interested anymore to do some more programming. But of course, I did want to know how the solution looked like, because maybe there was a mistake. There could be a mistake in my encoding. There could be a mistake in all the transformations. So I still needed to know what this mapped to. So yeah, I just wrote it on paper because I was tired. So here are all the variables, and this is what they map to. And look at that. This is a tie. This is how it looks like. Of course, a next question would be, how many of such ties are there? There are also tools you can use, but that is for another talk. So again, if you want to check out what I did, you can go to GitHub, and the program that generates the rules for Quarto is separated from the program that does the transformation to Dmax. So if you have something else you want to generate SAT input for, you can write it in a somewhat readable format in my F# DSL and then transform it into that crazy format. And it now also parses back the output. So you can run it and you can type N, P, or Q, and then it will tell you what the assignment is. So you could say, well, you spent the whole night and all these talks on just a board game. Yes, that's a sad fact. However, there are lots of realistic applications where SAT solvers can really help you. So if you have some other programming needs apart from board games, let me take you through a few real-life situations where this could also help you. For example, suppose you have to make a roster. You have some people, employees or tennis players, doesn't really matter, and you have to divide them in some groups, but there are constraints. Because B wants to be in a group with A, but doesn't want to be in a group with C, so there are constraints. You can easily solve this using satisfiability. Let's say we want to have 2 groups, doesn't really matter, but 2 is easy because then we can give everyone 1 bit. So everyone gets 1 bit, and if you want more groups, of course you just give people more bits. And then you can say, okay, the bit that I'm going to give to B has to be equal to the bit that I'm going to give to A, because they're in the same group, and it shouldn't be the case that those two get the same bit. So it's quite easily to express this in satisfiability, and this nicely generates to all sorts of planning and scheduling programs. So there are scientific papers on how to use SAT solving to make basketball game rosters. So that's really an interesting space where you can easily use SAT. Another real-life example where you can use it is to answer the question, are 2 processes the same? So suppose you have a specification robot machine that says, okay, the minimum of 0 and 0 is 0, and of 0 and 1 is still 0, and of 1 and 1 the minimum is 1. You have a second robot, let's say the implementation robot, that says, my program is, if A is B or not B, then A, else B. Are these 2 the same? Is this specification program a good is this implementation program a good implementation of this specification? This is also very solvable using SAT, because you can say for any given input, it has to be the case that this guy gives the same answer as this one. And typically this is done on a finite set of input spaces. If you can have all integers, then of course it will be very hard to go through all of them. But if your input space is not too big or you sample, then you can find mismatches between specification and implementation. And this is done in lots of different types of testing, specifically hardware testing, but also, for example, in DNA sequencing, where biologists want to know if 2 strings of DNA are the same, then this is something you can use there as well. So that's more or less everything I wanted to talk to you about. Because it's very warm, it is possible that you have fallen asleep. So in case that happens, this is the time to wake up, because I will summarize my entire talk in like 1 minute. So this is the one-time offer. This is your chance to still get the gist of my talk. So I wanted to solve the board game of Quarto, but doing it brute force is very expensive and would take you like 90 hours. So I decided to use some science. I used SAT solvers, and I explained to you 2 tricks that SAT solvers use, namely unit resolution and watches. I then made a little library in F# to take input files and transform them into the lovely Dmax input format. And then I got my answer that indeed it is possible for this game to end in a tie. And in addition to that, I also showed you 2 real-life applications, scheduling and hardware testing, where you can also use SAT programs to help make your life easier. That's it. We have some room for questions, so if there are questions, shoot.
Do you have any idea how many solutions there are?
No. Well, so the question is, do I have any idea how many solutions there are? Define how many solutions. So
how many positions there are that are actually
yeah, but what is a position? So are we going to count turns? Are we going to count mirrored? Does that count or doesn't it count? So I mean, I don't know, but you have to specify it a bit more precisely on what exactly you see as equivalent boards. Also, are all the properties equal? But not this SAT solver, but there are SAT solvers out there as well that can tell you how many solutions there are. But then you would, as I said, you need to specify a little bit more what exactly are the conditions of equal setups.
Have you tried finding a solution using Solver in Microsoft Excel, just modeling the game in Excel?
This is a question about Excel. That's unfortunately out of scope. I clearly declared that at the beginning of this talk. This is my day off. Anyone else? Well, of course it would be possible. It's Turing complete, you know. Ah, sorry, I can tell myself. Any other question? Okay. Oh, yes. Ah, go ahead.
The explanation of watches, I don't know if anyone else got it, but I would. Because these things move and
So I'm asked to repeat quickly, briefly, how watches work. So the idea of the watches is you're only looking at the watches to see if unit resolution is possible. So you're not going to go to the entire clause. You're only looking at the watches. So it's an optimization.
what is possible if there's only one
Variable unassigned. So if everything is red and one is still question mark, white in my example, that is the situation that you can say, okay, all the others are red, so this has to be true. But if you still don't get it, I can make you some examples on paper over lunch. Yes?
I'm wondering, this set solution is really fast. Is there any knowledge available how much faster it will be in general?
It's a good question. So the question is, how much faster are they in general? So there's only one very sad answer to that. In general, it's just as slow, because it's still NP hard. So it's always possible for any SAT solver to come up with an example where there is no other way for the thing is to try all options. You have to be a bit creative to come up with that, but of course it's possible that every time you make a decision, you get into a conflict and you have to backtrack. So then effectively you're still exploring the entire state space. That is the theoretical answer. But in practice, the speed up I showed you is quite realistic. But you can never count on it being that, because in practice it's still NP hard.
Have you actually tried to brute force approach? Because you assume that in 90 hours in 90 hours is only appropriate if there is no solution, because you have to try everything. But if there are thousands and thousands of solutions, that perhaps your brute force approach would actually find it in, like, say, an hour, half an hour.
Yeah, so the question is if I actually implemented the brute force solution. No, that's boring. How short would this talk have been? Yo, guys, I wrote 5 for loops, and after an hour I had an answer. See you at lunch. This is fun.
It's not true, because you have the possibility for the exact same optimization, because we don't have to try every solution. You can give the first row, if you have only tried 4 positions and you already know, so you can pull in the 3.
Yeah, so it's possible, of course, if you brute force, it is possible that you get lucky. But I mean, I'll happily do a program off, you write the for loops, get back to me when it's finished. And maybe I'm back home then. Yes?
This is really interesting, but how is this related to the
The question is, how is this related to DDD? I don't know. Well, I don't know anything about DDD. So someone in the DDD community told me that the transformation would be somewhat DDD related, because you take reality and you map it onto a domain model. And then you solve it. But, I mean, it's just a fun talk, and if you have questions why it's on the lineup, then that would not necessarily be for me, I guess. Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering if any of this stuff is used in AI and machine learning as well?
Yes, yeah, there are lots of combinations. Then typically, if the question is whether these tools are used in AI, it's not SAT solvers, but constraint solvers. So they have the same principles, but you can instead of specifying things in Booleans, you can say this integer has to be above 5 and this has to be 2 times that one. So you can specify constraints, and then it solves, and it internally uses similar technology. And those things are used in program derivation, lots of theoretical formal modeling and formal model checking. Yes?
The different SAT solvers come up with different solutions. If there are multiple solutions, will they come up with different solutions? Would different solvers come up with different solutions?
Oh yes, that's a very good question.
Time, right?
Would different solvers come up with different solutions? Yes, and it's even possible that the same solver would come up with different solutions because some of them use randomization. Sometimes they get very stuck and they have the feeling, well, they're machines, so they don't have a feeling, but lots of the clauses have lots of false in them, and they think this is going nowhere, we'll throw the whole thing away. Well, I'm not going to go back in the slide, but if you go to my slides, you see in my output as well that it has restarts. So sometimes they just think this is going nowhere, and some of them use random seeds. So just take a random variable and assign it something random. Sometimes that's better than picking one and being wrong. So it could be that if you run it multiple times, you'd get different solutions.
So it doesn't give all the solutions. It doesn't give all the solutions. It just gives all the solutions.
Yes, in the way we ran it now, the way we ran this solver, it just gives one solution. But there are options where you could give it all, where it could return all, but then again, you have to look at when is it the same. Okay, thank you very much.